Hello, I'm Jimmy James again, continuing my story about my flying life. At the end of the war, when I returned to the UK, life was very different from that before I left, of course, because I'd left as a naive, inexperienced schoolboy and came back 4 years plus later as a grown-up, but still basically naive. I had flown an enormous number of hours and been involved in all sorts of operations of Transport Command, landing behind the lines, as I've said before, I think. But we had been taking part in campaigns in Sicily, Italy, the whole of the North African campaign, and also preparing people for the Japanese war that was about to hit. We were involved in parachute dropping in the Dodecanese Islands, and that was a hair-raising affair. And also in Malta, supplying Malta during the Blitz. The second part of the Blitz was also very hair-raising. The requirement of a VIP pilot or a VVIP pilot is that when you're called to go, more often than not, you really have to go. It's not a question of is the weather good enough. If the Prime Minister or the head of the armed forces is due to meet his opposite number somewhere in Europe or attend a peace conference, you have to be there. Now, the point I want to get over is that in the post-war period, all the facilities for radios, weather forecasting, navigation devices, they were all pretty rugged and ragged and very basic. So as opposed to modern day flying, when all the new electronic facilities are available, we were flying in very basic conditions. Quite often the message by long landlines to airfields in Yugoslavia or Greece would often, you'd never get through, but you didn't know that the flight had not been passed through. And also the weather could often vary from dreadful, unexpected weather. The forecasters were very, very good, but they had so little material from these places we were suddenly having to go through that it could be very, very tricky at times. Going to Germany, for instance, was a fairly regular feature, flying many different kinds of VIPs, but you could never be sure what sort of weather you were going to get in Germany. And also right across Europe, and many of you may remember that in the post-war years, the winters were very, very bad, and particularly in England, for example, huge branches of trees were falling off with the sheer weight of the ice that we had, as well as the thick snow that remained with us for weeks, if not months on end. Also, the famous England and London fogs were ever present, and they were extraordinarily difficult to overcome because they could never be forecasted properly. But I've no complaint about the general forecasters. They did the best they could in the circumstances. One of the things, most extraordinary things that we had as VVIP pilots, a certain number of us were given the authority to overrule whatever air traffic control there was, and that included London, Northolt, and other places in Paris and in Germany. This sounds like a wonderful excuse for getting off and doing your own thing, but it also, the blessings were countermanded with the decision to fly sometimes when perhaps you should have been brave enough to say no. But if the Prime Minister has to be back in Parliament in 2 hours' time for a major debate, you can hardly say we can't go, sir. So what I've done is to pick out a few of the VIPs I flew on some of the occasions. Some of them I flew many times indeed. It was a life full of excitements, full of hair-raising experiences, and it's something which I value as my past, but nevertheless I do have some sleepless nights even to this day. The first and most important man I flew, I suppose, at that time was Mr. Attlee, the Prime Minister. It was generally thought he was a very poor exchange for Mr. Churchill, whose very appearance was enough to make everyone feel good. And particularly after the war, everyone thought that he would be there with us, seeing us through. Mr. Attlee was a quiet chap, short, like a Welsh Presbyterian minister with a Homburg hat. He was fairly shy. And when I flew him to the Blackpool post-war conference of the Labour Party with Mr. Ernie Bevin, the great foreign minister, I wondered what the reception was going to be like. And there, when we taxied in, were the whole of the famous post-war Labour cabinet, and they were fiery. Mr. Ernie Bevin was there, Mr. Aneurin Bevin was there, and one or two other fiery people. But the moment Attlee stepped out of the aircraft, they all behaved like little mice, like a children's kindergarten. He did have a power and a presence that I was quite staggered at. And everybody sort of rushed towards him in the end. He was, within the cabinet, a very respected and powerful man. But I just thought I'd mention that in passing. Later on, I got a special call. I mean, I was only one of several VIP pilots, I should say. I got a special call to fly Mr. Attlee to Paris for the Paris famous post-war peace conference. Representatives from all the other allies, heads of state were there, Mr. Truman, Chiang Kai-shek, and others. And so we went on a very nice day, landed. I had this marvellous crew flying for me now. We literally believed we could all do anything, so it was a lovely comfort zone. But we landed on a happy day. We were all introduced by Mr. Attlee to all the ambassadors and everyone else. And away he went for the peace conference. We decided to walk around Paris and have a look. My two members of the aircrew disappeared. And when I got back in the evening, ready to take off the following day, none of them were present. And the awful thing was that we all went to bed wondering where they were, but we had to be up at 5 o'clock because Mr. Attlee had suddenly been called to go back to England. His cabinet had decided that they couldn't agree with the decision he was going to have to make about the post-war period of Europe and the way the Allies were going to control Germany and other countries, and it meant that he had to go back and get cabinet approval. So the message to me waiting in the evening was from the British Air Attaché, I want you to get off by 8 o'clock because you've got to go. Mr. Attlee makes a speech in Parliament, gets approval of the cabinet, and then you fly him back for the late afternoon session. I thought this is all very well. So I got the aircraft refueled and all those sort of things. And when the following morning, when I went to wake up my crew, two of them, quite innocently, had been given Mickey fins. So I got them dressed, put them into the van taking us to the small airfield outside Paris. My second pilot was very raw, and the quartermaster, or the senior steward as we had, was a very helpful, keen guy. So we got out to the airfield and I decided to go to Le Bourget, where I had to pick up Mr. Attlee. I thought, thank God I'll get there, and then we'll get them awake and we'll make it. You see, you couldn't say, I'm awfully sorry, but my crew are all sick and I can't go. The prestigious nature of this flight was typical of the burden you carried as the VIP captain. And of course, that's what I did. We no sooner got airborne as the dawn was breaking in Paris, when it was a total white cloud fog right across Paris. And as I was going along, I could just see the top of the Eiffel Tower. And I knew from there what the course was by something disagreement I'd had the day before with the navigator. And from there I let down, knowing it was exactly 4.5 miles to Le Bourget Airport. I called them and they forbade me to land. They said, you can't land, the weather's far too bad. We are closing the airfield. It is closed. So I tried to tell them I was VVIP pilot who had authority to do what I liked, but the frogs, of course, wouldn't accept this at all. So I carried on and managed to see the runway in the last about 100 feet off the ground and taxied in, where I was then placed under close arrest. And I could not get them. They were so angry Then fortunately, Mr. Attlee's car arrived on the scene. There were at least 100 gendarmes with all their kepes and the white batons. So I turned round to them and said, "Do you want to hold me back? Or do you want me to go and take Mr. Attlee to this vital conference? We will see you when you get back," said they. So I took off, and my 2 other members of the crew had not recovered. And I suppose this is one of the most irresponsible things I've ever done. But the pride of the RAF, the importance of the occasion for Mr. Attlee to be back to meet the heads of state late in the afternoon was much more important. So I called all the controls I could, telling them all sorts of stories about radio being not very good. Would they please help me? And they all accepted, and I flew on top of the cloud about 2,000-3,000 feet to England, where I let down over the English Channel, roughly, and thank God we flew across Hastings, which every aviator knows, with the castle and the cliffs there. And I flew very, very low, just under the cloud, into the Thames. And thank God when we got there, I turned left. I know it sounds awfully irresponsible, but we were doing it. And as we were going down the Thames, at about 100 feet, I turned round to my quartermaster and said, "Will you please go back and ask Mr. Attlee if he'd like to see the House of Commons, which we were going to go past?" And he apparently said, "Oh, we'd be delighted. Ernie and I would be delighted." This is the British Foreign Minister. So I did a very low pass the House of Commons with a great sweeping. We just got over Waterloo Bridge, and I really felt good now I was making it. And we got in to land at Northolt, where they were horrified that I was landing in these circumstances, and there were reports coming in about a low-flying Dakota. Incidentally, all our Dakotas were beautifully silvered and highly polished. Well, I got the 2 people surreptitiously into the doctor's, and by the time Mr. Attlee came back, it was about 3:30. It had been a very successful day for him, and he was very pleased. I was glad he was pleased, because in the course of the flight to London, I had to leave my controls in the hands of a very raw second pilot, as it happened that day, and went back to see if he was all right. A very quick, short trip. And he was smoking his pipe, which was totally forbidden in those days, until the captain of the aircraft told him the fumes had gone. He was absolutely incensed by my telling him that he had to put his pipe out, and he threw it into his pocket with his thumb over the top. Now, when I came back to say it was all right to smoke now, he had just put the pipe in his mouth and was smoking and puffing away. He'd never really put it out, so even great men can be naughty, can't they? When we landed, Mrs. Attlee met us. She always drove with the Prime Minister. I'd heard stories about this, but she actually was waiting there, and he had to introduce me to her. And he had no idea what we'd been through, this hair-raising journey. And eventually he came back, and we flew to Paris, to everyone's joy, a huge reception, everybody pleased we'd made it. Little did they know, but this is a typical emergency that can exist in VIP flying. I also flew Dr. Evatt, the Prime Minister of Australia, who was a bluff chap who wanted to land in all sorts of places in Germany, and I had great problems telling him he would have to land at the place we were appointed in Munich, because there was a huge reception for him. But he was a typical lovely warm Aussie who had to be spoken to very, very crossly indeed. I also flew Field Marshal Smuts, the Prime Minister of South Africa, a member of the Imperial War Cabinet in both World Wars. This great man, the founder of the commandos in South Africa, now on our side, thank God. He was exactly as all the pictures had shown, his little goatee beard, a sparkling eye, in army uniform, and was such a warm and delightful man. He just literally put his arms around my shoulder, and I was part of his family. We landed in Paris, where he wanted me to go out, not out with him, but to go attend some of the receptions, but I couldn't do so because we had so much to do. And the following day he came back and we flew on to Brussels. Now, at Paris, he had huge meetings and made a speech. And the speech he did there and did for the next 3 days in all the various parliaments was the speech that Winston Churchill was going to give on the future of a united Europe, which everybody claims to have been the authors of, but it was Mr. Churchill's speech. He wasn't reading it, of course, but he was making it. And he was quite often said, "Oh, this is Winston's speech and it's an honour and a privilege for me to do it." So we flew to The Hague the following day. Lovely weather, delightful. Huge receptions, Queen Wilhelmina and all the royal family, and a parade of at least 1,000 people on it. And Field Marshal Smuts insisted that I kept in his entourage all the time, which was a little embarrassing since although I had my best blue uniform on, I was not quite in that scene, I thought. And afterwards he went off. He found out that our accommodation was not very well prepared by the air attaché, and this was quite normal. After all the Lord Mayor show, we often finished up with the dust collectors, but that's part of life. And when you've been in the desert as long as I had, there was no problem. But the fact of the matter is that he insisted, Yanni Smuts, that we would put in better accommodation. And when we got into this lovely Paris, he was there insisting that I joined him at all the great receptions of the day. I'm only mentioning this, that I was quite unprepared for it, but it shows what a wonderful, warm man, and anyone who's ever met him all think the same way. A clever politician. Winston Churchill wouldn't do anything in the Imperial Cabinet without Yanni Smuts' support. He was one of those great guiding people behind the scenes. We then took off the following day with the farewells to everybody and on to Brussels. Not a long trip, about 3/4 of an hour. The weather was perfect. It was forecast to be perfect. And so when we got near, there was a huge white thick fog from the ground all the way up to 1,000 feet. Startlingly bright above and solid white all the way down. It was an extraordinary experience. We weren't quite sure what quite to do. So I went back and told the Field Marshal my dilemma, and his actual words were, "I'm in your hands, Jimmy." And that's all. And then very pleased he was that. So my navigator was the top man on this occasion, and we called the control tower and said, "Would you fire up through the fog as I'm turning on to the final approach, just sitting above the fog, would you fire a maroon?" And I said, "Just fire one and we'll see it and we'll know if we're dead in line." And eventually a great big red blob came out of the fog, and we lowered down a steady descent, and without any other facilities we broke cloud at about 100 feet again. And unfortunately there were lorries and tractors and all sorts of things on the runway. It was too late to overshoot. I was so glad to be on the ground. We had landed at the wrong airfield to the east of Brussels. There are two airfields that were within sight of each other, and the air traffic controller at the wrong airfield, on hearing asking for a maroon, fired one. And that's the one we locked onto and didn't see the other one. And it was only a matter of a few degrees difference on the final approach, a bit like Norfolk and North Holt and London Airport. It wouldn't take much to do it there. We missed the tractors and the steamrollers and the workmen throwing their shovels and picks in the air. I did an emergency braking, taxied back to the end of the runway, and went back and spoke to the Field Marshal. And I said, "Sir, I'm in the most embarrassing thing. We've landed in impossible weather in the wrong airfield." To his great joy, he said, "Well, isn't that the most marvellous story? I shall dine out on this for the rest of my life." I said, "We have two options: to wait here for nearly an hour till some transport and VIP stuff comes along for you, or I can try again." And as again he said, "Jimmy, I am in your hands." And so I went to the runway and put full emergency power on and took off into the fog, which also is a questionable action to take. And I flew back to the outskirts of Brussels above the cloud, and I asked them again if they could repeat. And they said, well, we did fire a red. I said, this time, would you fire a green, and only you fire the green? And they did, and my navigator had me dead on course, and we did another blind landing at Brussels-Hiver, where we taxied in to the King of Belgium, King Baudouin, slapping his thighs, shaking hands with Field Marshal Smuts and saying, typical of the RAF, nothing stops them. It was a lovely moment. And Yanni Smuts didn't say a word about landing on the wrong runway, nor did I until today. That's the first official occasion. So lots of VIP receptions. And then we went off to Paris again, where he made another speech. Thank God the weather was reasonable there. So it was a very hair-raising journey, knowing really how to behave in front of VVIPs, how to look after them, and how to fly them and get them there irrespective of the weather. You were more or less expected to do that. I suppose I was a little, I don't know, not cautious enough, and yet we did the job, I suppose. Later on, I flew, there was an emergency in Palestine in 1947. General Browning, who was the cabinet military secretary, was asked by Mr. Attlee to take dispatches to Jerusalem to say that if they didn't stop this interfighting, which we'd been piggy in the middle of for years, we were going to pull out of Palestine and leave them to it. And this is in fact what happened, but it was after years of this awful fighting between them as it is now. Nothing's changed since 1947. And when we got into Tel Aviv, Lydda Airport, there were lots of farewells. There was an armoured car, lots of jeeps absolutely covered in guns, machine guns, and this huge escort then drove General Browning to Jerusalem, supposedly to deliver his dispatches in person. That's how important it was. We took off to go back to the Middle East, my old home, where a huge reception was waiting for me, and all my old mates were there waiting. And I was very, very happy to disappear. In a very nice party that evening, the dinner was stopped, and the group captain in charge of the base called me over and said, there's a message to say. You've got to go back to Tel Aviv first thing in the morning. The General Browning was unable to get through with all that convoy of parachutists and God knows what. That's how bad things were. And there was a message which said, telex, which said, which General, I've forgotten, the commanding general of the Canal Zone asked me to go and see him to say, I think you ought to see this. It says that the airfield is too small for a Dakota at Jerusalem. You have to fly in there. You don't have to, but we think you ought to. The Cabinet and the Secretary of State for Air has said if there's one person who could probably pull this off, it is Flight Lieutenant James. Well, when you see a thing with that, I mean, you think, well, I've got to go, haven't I? Which was, again, a very silly thing to do. So we landed at a place called Columbia, which is nearly 4,500 feet up, right on the side of Jerusalem, overlooking the valley of Kidron, and you can see the Mount of Olives from the end of it. We got in with a hair-raising emergency landing, but this is what I'd been doing in the Western Desert and teaching everybody else. So for me, perhaps it was a normal hair-raising landing. The point was, how were we going to get off? Because there were rocks and all round and a bit of a slope in front of us. But off went General Browning, and the following day he had to come back and get off as fast as he could with some special messages which couldn't be transmitted. He had to hand carry them in to Mr. Attlee and Ernie Bevan. So we got the aircraft ready. They had so much baggage, I had to make them take it all off. I don't know how that ever got home. And I put the tail of the aircraft over on the rough ground, and I put full brakes on, full power, and the tail came up, and there's not a lot of clearance for the propellers. And then I let go, and we went trundling down that runway, on that very short runway, which became shorter and shorter. And I kept thinking, if we don't make this, we're going to prang right into the Mount of Olives. And a silly thought came through my mind, oh, my mother will be so pleased. You know, Hugh Bach dying on the Mount of Olives. It sounds silly, doesn't it? The Garden of Eden or whatever. And so we barely got off the ground. In fact, I didn't have flying speed when we got to the end of the runway, and I just ran it, and we sank slowly around Jerusalem's walls and climbed around the city, tried to find those valleys, and eventually got over the Dead Sea and started to climb very slowly. The whole of that journey was hair-raising because all the airfields in the North African coastline all went out. The sandstorms hit. The alternative was to go into Athens. Athens had screamingly strong rainstorms, which were all over the place there, and it was impossible to land there. Sicily was too bad to land in, so I headed for Malta. And when we got there, we were getting there very slowly because we were running out of fuel, but there was nowhere to go. And we just had this great big beacon in Malta telling us that it was straight ahead. I went down as low as I could go in the dark and in the rain, and it really was a hair-raising experience. General Browning and all his staff were fast asleep in the back, which is the way it should be, but I often wonder if they really knew what was going on in the front. At the last moment, we saw the red lights, which are top of the hill behind Valletta Harbour, which I knew intimately after my years of supplying Malta in the war. And I just climbed up and tried not to hit the lights, but just to pop over them in the dark, in this awful weather, turned onto the course, the airfield heading, which I knew well, and put flaps and wheels down, and the runway came up as we cleared the cloud. And again, one of those hair-raising but amazing landing, and we taxied in with great difficulty because the airfield was shouting the whole time, you are not allowed to land irrespective of your personal powers. The air officer commanding Malta refuses to let you land, which gives you a rough idea of the difficulties of a VIP pilot. And so I just quietly said to them, could you look out of your window? And when they did, they looked down and saw the lights on my wingtips, and that's about all they could see, and the engines churning. It was a very difficult time, and I swore that I would kill every one of them if I could get up in the tower in time. Surprisingly, not one of them were in the tower when I got there. And so the next day we flew on to England. General Browning very, very happy and did his job and wrote a charming letter afterwards, which clearly showed he had no idea what was going on behind the scenes. I use those as examples of how hair-raising VIP flying could be. There were other occasions where nothing like that occurred. Of course, they were straightforward. Once I was asked by Lord Tedder, the Chief of the Air Staff, if I'd fly into Netheravon, where a massive army exercise was taking place. There were huge numbers of paras to be dropped dead on the airfield, and the whole Air Council decided they would go with the Chief of the Air Staff. I had met Lord Tedder once or twice before, and so that was it was nice to have him on board. Unfortunately, he had on board the whole of the Air Council. I looked around and I practically fainted to have this whole panoply, including the Secretary of State for Air. And I suddenly thought, and Lord Tedder said, I know what you're thinking. It'll be a great day for a promotion if we go down. And that was the attitude. He was such a good fellow, Lord Tedder. Some people are critical of him, but my personal relationship with him, on the few occasions I met him, was that he was a brilliant leader. And so we landed, and that was fine. The only other experience was that as they were all mingling outside the aircraft and waiting for cars to line up to take them off to the conference they were going to have there at Netheravon, there was an almighty swish as a blue Spitfire came roaring across the airfield right on the ground, upside down. And someone said, my God, this court-martial is going to be the Tower. This bloke doesn't realise that the whole of the Air Council, all the C&Cs are here. And then as it landed, it taxied right in towards us, and the canopy opened. The fellow took off his helmet, and there was a bald-headed man who was an air marshal, commander-in-chief of one of the commands, who just casually walked in. And I thought, what upmanship. But I also thought what a marvellous air force we had, that you could have an air marshal coming in prepared to do a beat-up and enjoying it at the same time. As I told you earlier, we meet all sorts of peculiar people, good people. There were some nasty people occasionally, and you had great difficulty being diplomatic. On one occasion, I was waiting for the VIPs to arrive when the Archbishop of Canterbury in gaiters came up to me and asked me where to go, where the VIP rooms were. And he was a charming man. It was Archbishop Fisher, who was one of those delightful people you meet in time. And I said, I'll show you where to go. So I was quite nervous waiting for the next VIPs. So I took him along the corridor. And I said, well, Mr. Fisher, there is the group captain waiting to meet you. And then I saw, no, not Mr. Fisher, I'm sorry. I said, Mr. Cantab, I'm very pleased to meet you, and I hope you, I'm sure they're all there to greet you. He said, thank you very much, my dear boy, thank you very much. And by the way, the name's Fisher. I am the Archbishop of Canterbury. A very raw lesson to learn, indeed. Never made that mistake again. As I said in the beginning, these are just a few of the selected occasions and problems flying VIPs. But one of the most significant flights I ever had to do was to fly Princess Margaret to Northern Ireland to launch one of the huge Union liners. It was the very first individual single time she'd been on her own. Not with the Queen or the King, nor with Princess Elizabeth. And there suddenly, as we stood outside the aircraft, very nervous, came the great royal car, and down towards us came the Queen Mother, because the King was desperately ill at that time. And so she was with the two princesses. Well, I could feel my knees shaking so badly, because it was one of those beautiful occasions. They looked extraordinarily beautiful, and the occasion was just wonderful. And I heard the Queen Mother, then the Queen, say to Princess Margaret, it's all right, my little girl, it's all right, you'll be okay. You're in good hands, you'll soon get over your nerves, you're all right, we are thinking about you. And then Princess Elizabeth joined in and was doing the soothing words and patting her, and I thought, it may be the royal family, but it's so typical of all of us in those quiet moments. I was the only one who heard it because I was right next saluting to point the way to the aircraft and accompany them. But it was so normal, a family occasion where everybody's helping out. And we got on board the aircraft, and I jumped up after the princess and stood in front of her. She had 20 in the party, 3 ladies in waiting who'd been sent by the Queen Mother to make sure she was all right, her own lady in waiting, and members of the royal staff, including the head of the Queen's flight, who was a very pompous Commodore, and of course Peter Townsend, group captain, who was equerry to the King at that time. He didn't sit next to her, he was sitting nearby, but it was during the time where all these things were going on. And Group Captain Townsend, this wonderful, famous fighter pilot of the war, was always said to be a nice chap and a great leader, but a nice chap to go with it. And I must say, he looked after me at all times in the most wonderful, helpful, diplomatic, gentlemanly way. I can't speak highly enough for him. I knew nothing more about him at the time. Well, just as I said, will you excuse me, Mom? I'd already got the engines going from my second pilot. I said, I just want to say a few words about the flight. It'll take us about 3/4 of an hour. And she just said, oh, excuse me. And this little, terrified little beautiful girl, I mean, if you look at any photographs of her at that time, it's stunning. And this little girl got up, turned to face all the others and said, now, I don't like this arrangement. Now, I don't want you there, nor you here. And suddenly it was like a rugby scrum on a mucky day. There were people banging into each other as they fought to get to the seats over each other's. And she wanted her layout, not the layout laid on. But it was one of those comic scenes. And then she said, thank you very much, and sat down as a prim little girl again. But I suddenly realized that later, when she was quite a fiery person. Anyway, she got everybody organized, and when she got out of the aircraft, there must have been 5,000-6,000 people cheering her in, as was the case in those days, landing in Northern Ireland. And as the Rolls-Royce was driving away with the national anthem being played and all the flags flying, she lowered the window and called me towards her. And I was already saluting, so I pulled my hand down and saluted again as the last bits of bars of the national anthem. And she said, I'd like you to join me to dinner, with dinner tonight. It'll be at the castle, but that'll be all right. And up went the window again and drove off. And I just completely stunned and perplexed by this, because it just wasn't on. Whereupon, when all the rest of the people came up, I said, I've just been invited to dinner. I suppose I ought not to go. And there were huge conferences going on, because the dinner for all VIP flying, as you can imagine, the Governor-General of Northern Ireland had planned it out. And unfortunately, she'd made the statement, and she confirmed it later on through Crew Captain Townsend. So I had to get my blessed uniform repressed, and a Rolls-Royce came to collect me, and I was driven to the castle, I don't think it's called the castle, but it's in Belfast, outskirts of Belfast, the Governor-General's residence. And there I was introduced to everyone. And Peter Townsend actually stood just behind me diplomatically the whole time, nudging, whispering. And it was a very fine dinner. I was the only person without a title at the dinner. How the heck she thought this up, I'll never know. And after dinner, they decided to play games, and then there was a little dancing, and she came across the room and grabbed hold of me. Suddenly, I'm doing a little foxtrot with her. So it was quite an extraordinary experience. And then we all said goodnight and left. The following day, she insisted I went to the races with the royal party. And I'm out of my depth completely, but I